The administrator's voice carried down the corridor at a pitch the overnight staff could hear through 2 sets of closed doors. "Forsyth, I'm telling you one time. If you're still in that room when I come back through this ward, don't bother showing up for your next shift." Dana Forsyth did not move from the chair beside the bed. 8 weeks later, neither would the world she thought she understood. The hospital sat on the west side of Hamilton, Ontario, wedged between a strip mall and a neighborhood of older bungalows where people left their porch lights on through February. Riverside General was mid-sized as hospitals went. Not a trauma center, not a teaching hospital, just the place people in that part of the city brought themselves when something went wrong at 2 in the morning. It had 340 beds, a cardiac unit on the 4th floor, and an ER that moved steadily through the night in a way that was almost rhythmic once you had worked enough of those nights to stop being surprised by anything. Dana had worked enough of them. She was 39 years old, an RN on the overnight rotation, and she had been in that building for 6 years. Her car had 180,000 kilometers on it, and she drove it because it still ran, and because the shift premium on nights added $4.20 an hour to her base rate, which was the margin between a month that worked and a month that didn't. She was raising her daughter Cora alone. Cora was 9 and had her mother's insistence on finishing what she started. Dana had been divorced for 3 years, and she did not talk about it at work, and when people asked, she said she was managing, and she said it in a way that was true without inviting anything further. What the other nurses knew about her was how she ran a shift. She learned every patient's name and used it. She read medication labels aloud to patients who were confused or scared, not because protocol required it, but because she had been on the other side of a hospital bed once, years earlier, and had understood nothing anyone said to her. She covered shifts when people called in. She stayed past the end of her block when a discharge plan wasn't settled. It cost her sleep, and sleep was the only currency she had less of than money. Craig Dunmore had been the director of patient flow and operational efficiency at Riverside General for 4 years. He had come in on a recommendation from a consulting firm the board had hired to improve the hospital's throughput metrics, and he had delivered on every number they had asked for. He carried an iPad everywhere he went because the iPad showed the dashboard in real time. Bed turnover rate, average length of stay by unit, intake to discharge intervals. The board sent him a summary every Monday, and he read it the way a farmer reads weather, looking for what to move and what to cut. His theory, which he stated often enough that the staff could repeat it, was that a hospital was a pipeline, and a pipeline's only job was to keep things moving. Sentiment was a blockage. Delay was cost leaving the building. 3 nurses on Dana's floor had learned to take their cues from him because it was easier than being the one he turned his attention toward. They moved fast. They documented quickly. When a patient asked a question that was going to take more than 90 seconds to answer properly, they noted it in the chart and moved on. They had not started out that way, but 4 years of watching what got rewarded had a way of teaching people without ever requiring a conversation about it. He used Dana because Dana could be used. She did not file complaints. When he added tasks to her assignment without adjusting her patient load, she completed the tasks. When he pulled her charting up on the dashboard in front of the nursing station to demonstrate that she was running behind, she said nothing and went back to finish. He had dressed her down in front of patients twice in the past year, and both times she had waited until she was in the supply room to let herself feel anything about it, and then she had gone back to work. On the 2nd Tuesday of February, at 17 minutes past 2 in the morning, a man came through the ER doors at Riverside General and told the triage nurse he had been feeling short of breath and dizzy since the previous afternoon. He gave his name as Edwin Palliser. He was 61 years old. He was wearing a canvas jacket that had once been green and was now the color of old leaves, a pair of wool trousers with the hem frayed at one cuff, and boots with the left heel worn down at an angle that meant he had been walking in them for years without replacing them. He was soft-spoken and apologetic, and he said 3 times that he was sorry for the trouble. The triage nurse asked for his OHIP card. Edwin said he didn't have it on him. He couldn't find his things, he said, and he didn't elaborate. He gave a postal code that didn't match any of the nearby neighborhoods. He was assigned a bed in observation and handed a paper gown and told someone would be with him. The nurse assigned to his bay that night was a woman named Cheryl, who had 4 other patients and was running 30 minutes behind on her charting at the start of the shift. She completed Edwin's initial intake correctly and efficiently and moved on, because moving on was the only way to keep pace with the bay she had been given. She was not unkind. She was busy in a way that had stopped feeling like busyness and had become simply the texture of the job. Dana noticed Edwin because she noticed everyone, and because at 20 minutes to 3 in the morning, he was sitting upright on the observation bed in his paper gown, with his canvas jacket folded on his knees, holding it there the way a person holds something they are afraid of losing. He hadn't asked for a blanket. It had not occurred to anyone to bring him one. She brought him a blanket. He looked at her as though she had done something surprising, and thanked her in a way that meant it. She came back 20 minutes later between her own tasks and asked if anyone had explained what the tests were for. He said not exactly. She sat down and explained the ECG in plain language, what it measured and what they were looking for, and why the blood pressure cuff would cycle every 15 minutes through the night. He listened carefully and asked one question, which was whether the dizzy spells were something to be concerned about. She told him honestly that dehydration alone could cause everything he was describing, and that they would know more after the results came back, but that his color looked better than when he'd come in. He smiled at that. He said he hadn't eaten properly since Sunday. It was Wednesday morning. Dana went to the cafeteria on her break and used her own money, $8.75, to buy him a bowl of soup and a sandwich, and she brought it back on a tray. He accepted it without protest, which told her he was hungry enough that pride had stepped aside. She sat with him while he ate, because he looked like a person who had not sat with another person in some time, and because his ECG results were due back within the hour, and she had said she would come back with them, and the gap between that promise and the results was a gap she chose to stay in, rather than leave him to count the minutes alone. Craig Dunmore arrived on the ward at 20 minutes to 7 for his morning review, which he conducted before the day shift came on, because he had found that the overnight numbers were where the inefficiencies hid. He walked the floor with the iPad and checked the bed status against the dashboard and stopped at the nursing station to pull up the chart for Bay 14. He found Dana in the room with the patient. He called her into the corridor. He did not close the door all the way. His voice was a carrying voice even when he wasn't trying to carry it, and he was not trying to keep it quiet. He said that she was 90 minutes behind on her charting. He said that Bay 14 had been in observation hold since 2:15, and that the bed was scheduled for a cardiac intake at 8, and that she had spent what appeared to be the better part of the last hour sitting with one patient while the rest of her assignment waited. He asked her if she understood what that kind of delay cost the unit, and whether she thought patient flow ran itself. Dana said the patient had not had anyone explain his tests to him. She said he was 61 years old. He was alone. He didn't know what was happening, and the ECG results were 40 minutes out. Craig said that was what patient liaisons were for, and that it was not her job to provide comfort care to adults who could ask questions if they wanted answers. He said her job was her assignment, and her assignment was 40 minutes behind. Then he looked past her into the room and noticed that Edwin had not signed the financial responsibility form. He asked who had handled the insurance intake. Dana said he didn't have his card on him and hadn't been able to reach anyone, and that she had planned to sort the form out once the results were back. Craig stepped partially into the doorway and addressed the situation in the way he addressed situations that he felt were inefficient, not by speaking to Edwin directly, but by speaking about Edwin to the general air of the corridor, loudly enough that Edwin could hear every word. He said the hospital was not a shelter. He said that without a valid insurance number on file, the patient was eating into discretionary resources that the unit did not have. He said the financial coordinator would be down within the hour, and that until the intake form was completed, the bed status could not be updated, and the morning numbers would reflect the block. Edwin's face did not change. He sat with the soup tray in front of him and his canvas jacket on his knees and said, quietly, that he understood and that he was sorry for the inconvenience. Dana turned back to Craig and said she would be out of the room in 20 minutes. Craig told her she had 5. After 5 minutes, she would be in breach of the operational directive he had issued in September, which she had been given in writing, and which specified that no nurse was to remain with a single patient for more than the allocated care block without formal reassignment. She stayed 20 minutes. The ECG came back clean. She explained the results to Edwin in the same plain language she had used earlier and told him his heart was fine, that what they were seeing was consistent with dehydration and fatigue, and that he would likely be kept for fluids and observation and discharged by afternoon. He said thank you. He said it the same way he had said it for the blanket, as though it was not a small thing. Craig was waiting in the corridor with another nurse present, and the nursing station computer pulled up to Dana's charting record. He read the suspension finding aloud from a document on his iPad. Failure to comply with operational directives during a monitored period, contributing to bed blockage in a priority unit, effective immediately. Her access to the scheduling system would be removed by end of shift. Dana asked who would follow through on Edwin's discharge plan. Craig said that was no longer her concern. She gathered her things from the locker room. She drove home in the car with 180,000 kilometers on it and sat in the driveway for 4 minutes before going inside, because Cora was still asleep, and she did not want to wake her with whatever was showing on her face. The job search lasted 6 weeks before she understood what was happening. The first 2 were almost normal. She had 6 years of nursing experience, a clean record, a willingness to work nights, and enough goodwill in the community that she got 2 interviews in the first week alone. She wore the same blazer to both. She explained the gap in her employment as a disagreement over workflow protocol, which was accurate, and she did not elaborate, because the person who elaborates is the person who sounds like they are making excuses. The hospital in Oakville brought her back for a second conversation and told her they would be in touch. They were not in touch. The family health team in Burlington got to the reference check stage and then stopped responding. A long-term care facility in Mississauga scheduled her for an orientation meeting and then canceled it by email with no explanation. It was a nursing supervisor at a clinic in Dundas who did her the courtesy of being honest. She said that she had contacted Dana's most recent employer as part of the standard process, and that the clinical director there had told her Dana Forsyth had been suspended for failure to comply with operational directives during a monitored period. She said she was sorry. She said it had come across as a compliance concern and that she wished her well. Dana stood in the parking lot of the clinic and thought it through with the kind of clarity that comes when there is nothing left to pretend. Craig had not lied. That was the particular skill of it. Every reference call he answered got a true sentence with nothing attached to it. No context, no footage, no bowl of soup and a frightened man in a paper gown. And there was nothing she could do about it, because correcting it meant telling strangers she had been suspended for staying beside a patient who needed someone to stay, and out of her own mouth in a parking lot that sounded like a story she was telling herself. The savings went the way savings go when there is not much of them to begin with. She cut the streaming services first. Then the gym membership she had been meaning to use more. She pushed the car payment by 2 weeks and paid the interest without saying anything about it to anyone. Cora asked twice why they weren't going out for dinner on Fridays anymore, and Dana told her they were saving up for something. She did not specify what. By the end of the 6th week, she was sitting at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night with a notepad and a calculator, doing arithmetic that came out the same, regardless of how many times she ran it. And she let herself ask the question plainly because she had never had patience for the version of courage that required softening things before looking at them. She had stayed in that room. She had spent $8.75. She had explained an ECG to a stranger at 3 in the morning and had been sitting beside him when the results came back clean, and she had watched something ease in his face that had been tight since she first noticed him holding his jacket against his chest in the fluorescent light of the observation bay, and it had cost her the job, the reference, and 6 weeks of her working life, and the man whose name was on the chart still did not know hers. She turned it over for a long time. What she arrived at, sitting there with the calculator, was that she would do it again. Not because it had led anywhere, because it hadn't, Not because there was any evidence that staying in that room had made a lasting difference to anyone, but because the alternative had been walking out of Bay 14 at 5 minutes' notice and leaving a 61-year-old man alone in a paper gown to count ceiling tiles until a financial coordinator arrived to ask him about his insurance. And she had not been able to make that alternative feel acceptable, regardless of how many ways she tried to frame it. She had told herself, sitting down in that chair at 20 to 3 in the morning, that she would not leave him without the results. That was still true. 6 weeks had not made it untrue. The letter came by courier on a Tuesday in the 8th week. It was from a law firm she had never heard of, and it said that her employment file at Riverside General was under review in connection with an incident during the February overnight rotation, and that her presence was requested at the hospital at 10 o'clock Thursday morning. It said nothing else. She read it twice. What she assumed was that someone in administration had finally reviewed the suspension documentation and wanted her to sign something that settled the record in the hospital's favor and released them from any obligation. She went because she had nothing else on Thursday, and because some stubborn, practical part of her still wanted to hear it said to her face by someone who was not Craig Dunmore. The hospital had been cleaned. She could smell the floor wax before she reached the front doors. Every staff member seemed to be on shift. The corridor off the main entrance was facing the shelves, so precisely it looked like a photograph of a hospital rather than one in use, and Craig Dunmore was standing at the end of it in his best blazer, with a folder of printed reports tucked under his arm. He saw her cross the lobby and told her, not quietly, that this was a private event for current staff and that she was here in the wrong capacity. She held up the letter. He did not read it. He told her to stand to one side and not speak to anyone, and she did because it cost her nothing. Then the vehicles came off the street. 3 black SUVs moving in a line, and they did not pull into the visitor spaces. They came up along the front of the building the way vehicles come when the people inside them are not accustomed to looking for parking. The sound of the doors opening was the clearest thing in the lobby. People in dark coats with document cases came out, and 2 of them positioned themselves at the entrance and did not explain why. A woman got out of the second vehicle. She was in her mid-40s, dark coat, no jewelry that Dana could see, and she looked at the front of the hospital the way a person looks at something they have bought without having seen it in person yet. She came around the door of the SUV and stood still for a moment, reading the building. Craig moved forward. He started his prepared sentence about performance results and year-over-year improvement in the bed turnover metric. The woman raised one hand, not urgently, just enough. "Dana Palliser," she said. "Give me a minute." Then the rear door of the first vehicle opened, and a man stepped out onto the pavement. He was in a canvas jacket the color of old leaves. He had wool trousers with a frayed cuff. He stood for a moment, looking at the glass doors he had come through on a Tuesday night in February, and then he looked through the lobby at the assembled staff until he found the woman standing to one side near the admissions desk in a coat that was not a uniform. He pointed at her. Edwin Palliser's voice was the same quiet voice it had been at 20 to 3 in the morning when he'd said sorry for the trouble, except that now the lobby was silent enough for everyone to hear it without him needing to raise it. "That woman stayed with me when I had no one." 10 weeks of arithmetic at a kitchen table left Dana's head all at once. She did not move. She had spent 2 months certain he didn't know her name, and he still didn't. He had pointed instead of saying it, and she would think afterward that this was exactly right, because she had never told him. Joanna addressed the staff assembled in the lobby and did not raise her voice, which made everyone lean forward slightly to catch it. She said that Palliser Health Group had completed the acquisition of Riverside General as of Monday morning, and that the transaction had been kept quiet deliberately. She said that her father had spent 4 years presenting himself as an ordinary patient at facilities. Their group was considering acquiring. No identification, no prior notification, no name that meant anything to anyone in the building. He had done this because he had learned, over 30 years of building hospitals, that the difference between what a facility said it did and what it actually did was visible only from the bed, and the only way to see from the bed was to be in it. She said that on the second Tuesday of February, 9 cameras in this building had recorded what ordinary patients received in this facility. 4 of them had audio. She and her legal team had reviewed every minute of the recording before the acquisition closed. Then she brought forward one of the lawyers, and it stopped being a statement about values and became something more specific. Craig Dunmore's employment was terminated effective immediately for conduct inconsistent with the standards of care the acquiring organization required, and for actions that had caused demonstrable harm to the professional standing of a staff member. The lawyer read the second finding while Craig was still holding his folder. The suspension record he had filed described Dana Forsyth as non-compliant during a monitored period. The incident report he had submitted to HR used the same language. Both were contradicted by footage the group's legal team had reviewed before the acquisition closed. The term used was misrepresentation. 3 other staff members, the ones whose voices appeared on the corridor audio, agreeing with language Craig had used in the hallway outside Bay 14, were walked to the side by members of the legal team to collect their belongings. Each finding was read individually. Each person was given the same document to sign. Craig asked for his folder of reports to be looked at. He said the year-over-year numbers were the strongest in the regional comparison group. Joanna said the numbers were not in dispute. She said she had read them on the drive from the airport, and that they were part of why the facility had been available at a price the group could move on. She did not say anything further to him. She turned back to the 11 staff members, still standing in the corridor, the ones who had been present the morning of Dana's suspension and had said nothing, because saying something was not a thing you did when Craig Dunmore was the one doing the talking. She looked at them for a moment. Then she asked her legal team to set up the table near the admissions desk, and she brought Dana forward by name. She told everyone present what the security footage had shown. A nurse who had stayed 2 hours past her assigned block on a February overnight, who had used her own money to buy food for a patient who hadn't eaten since Sunday, who had explained a medical procedure in plain language to a frightened man, because no one else had done it, and who had been suspended for it in front of her colleagues the following morning. Joanna read from the legal summary: wrongful suspension, back pay for the full period, interference with subsequent employment. The firm had contacted 4 of the facilities that had declined to hire Dana in the months following, and 2 of them had confirmed in writing that they had received a reference from Riverside General that described her as non-compliant. The harm was documented. The compensation was on the table before the meeting concluded. Edwin came across the lobby while his daughter was still speaking. He walked at the pace of a man who was not in a hurry and had not been for some time. He stopped a foot away from Dana and looked at her the way he had looked at her from the observation bed when she set the soup tray on the table in front of him. He said he had asked after the nurse from Bay 14 on his discharge morning. He had been told they couldn't give out staff information. He had asked again through a formal request the following week and had been told the staff member was no longer employed at the facility. He had spent 2 months assuming she was fine and trying to believe it. He said he had built 23 health facilities across this country and had spent 30 years telling boards and investors and government committees that patient-centered care was the foundation of everything. And at 2:40 in the morning on a Tuesday in February, he had found out what patient-centered care actually looked like when someone was doing it without an audience and without any expectation of return. He said it looked like a chair pulled up beside a bed. It looked like a bowl of soup and someone who stayed. He took her hand in both of his. He said, "I want to know your name. I never got to know your name." She told him. He repeated it once, the way you repeat a name when you intend to remember it. The lawyers finished at a folding table set up near the counter. The back pay was calculated. The interference compensation was explained and signed for. The figure for the wrongful suspension, when the lawyer laid it in front of her, was larger than Dana had expected. Large enough that she read the number twice and then set the document down for a moment. Then Joanna sat across from her after the legal team stepped back and said the part she had come to say. Palliser Health Group was restructuring its patient care standards across all 23 facilities. They needed someone who had stood at a bedside and been measured in throughput rates to write the document that replaced the current framework. Not to consult on it, to author it, and then to train every manager in every facility on its implementation. She said this was not a thank you. The money was the thank you, and it had already been paid. She said the footage had shown her something she couldn't fix from a boardroom. That a culture which produced a director like Craig Dunmore and sustained him for 4 years was not a problem with one person. It was a problem with what the building counted and what it didn't, and she needed someone who had lived on the wrong side of that measurement system to write the thing that corrected it. Dana did not accept immediately. She said why. She told Joanna that she had no interest in being anyone's example. If she took this role because she had happened to stay beside the right patient on the right night, then the lesson every person in that training room would take away was that decency pays off when you get lucky. And that was not a lesson worth an hour of anyone's time, because 99 times out of 100 it didn't work that way, and pretending otherwise was its own kind of dishonesty. Joanna said that was precisely the argument she wanted written into the first module. Dana accepted with one condition, and she framed it as a condition rather than a request. The training had to cover every employee in every facility, not just nurses, not just managers, but orderlies and volunteers and the people who brought the meal carts around at 6 in the morning, and the 11 staff members still standing in that corridor, the ones who had watched Craig dress her down in the nursing station and had not said a word, because saying a word was not something you did in that building. They did not get let go. They got trained. The guard at the ER entrance, who had been following protocol for 4 years, needed the same training as everyone else, and firing people for silence taught nothing, because silence was the actual problem, and silence was something that could be changed. Joanna agreed before she finished the sentence. Dana started the following Monday. The first 6 weeks were unglamorous. She sat with the Palliser legal team and with district administrators who had spent their careers reading bed turnover reports and wrote the standard herself. From the beginning, the way you write something when you know it has to hold. The measurement changed first because she had learned behind 2 years of overnight shifts that people did what got counted, and if what got counted was only how fast the bed cleared, then the bed would clear fast regardless of what was left behind in the process. Bed turnover rate stayed in the monthly report. It dropped to the 3rd line. Patient resolution score and complaint index went above it. A director who moved patients through quickly and generated 4 complaints in the same quarter no longer looked good on paper, and once that was true, the behavior started adjusting on its own in ways that no amount of policy language alone would have produced. The training was 4 hours, mandatory across all facilities. Dana delivered the first several sessions herself at Riverside General. She never showed the security footage. She was asked to more than once, and she refused every time, because Edwin Palliser had been a frightened man in a paper gown in the middle of the night, and she was not going to use that image to make a point in a training room. She described what had happened instead, in the order it had happened, and that turned out to be sufficient. Cheryl sat in the front row of the first session and asked the only question anyone asked that day. What should she have done differently that night? Dana told her the honest answer. One person pausing for 5 minutes to explain one test to a patient who looked like he didn't know what was happening would have been enough. Not a chair pulled up for 2 hours, not a bowl of soup. 5 minutes of explanation to a man who had not been told what an ECG was and who was too polite to ask. That was the entire gap between what had happened and what should have happened, and the fact that 5 minutes had felt unaffordable was the thing they were all in that room to change. Several months later, Riverside General's patient satisfaction data came in for the quarter, and it was the highest the facility had recorded since the current tracking system was implemented. The report noted the improvement without explanation. Dana read it at a desk she had not asked for and did not make much of the number, because she had been in the building enough days since to know what it looked like at ground level. A nurse explaining a blood pressure result without being asked. Someone finding an extra blanket without being told there was a need. A corridor that moved at a pace that was slightly less hurried and generated considerably fewer complaints. Edwin Palliser came back for a follow-up appointment in the spring. He wore the same canvas jacket. He drove himself, and he parked in the visitor lot like everyone else. The staff knew who he was now, which he had never particularly wanted, and it turned out to matter Somewhat less than he had feared, because the way they treated him was the same way they had started treating the man who came in every second week for his blood pressure check and always apologized for taking up time, and the woman who moved slowly in the corridor and thanked everyone who held a door for her. He was greeted, he was helped, no one described him as a blockage. That was what he had come in on a February night to find out. Dana understood by the time the spring data came in what had actually changed her life. It was not the arrival of a man who turned out to own 23 hospitals. The SUVs were an accident, a consequence of which patient had walked through the ER doors at 17 minutes past 2 on a particular February morning, nothing more. The thing that had changed everything was a decision made at 20 to 3, with a supervisor's directive still in her ears, and a man sitting alone in a paper gown at the end of a corridor, to pull up a chair and stay. A decision she had made without any expectation that anyone was watching. A decision she had defended for 8 weeks while it cost her everything it had cost her, and would have made again if no one had ever come back through those doors. You did not measure a person's value by how efficiently they moved through a system. You measured it by what they did when the system told them to move faster, and they looked at the person in front of them and chose to stay. That was the first line of the training document. It was also the last.